publications recommends him as a specialist and passionate scholar. Mr. Fineur currently holds the position of Head of Arms Proliferation at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. On the behalf of the aspiring South Asian Journal of International Law, we invite him to sketch an insight on how our society will design its security approaches in these turbulent times. Good afternoon, Mr. Fineur.
Hello, thank you very much for the invitation. I feel very flattered to be invited by such a prestigious international journal. And so I'm willing now, of course, to answer any questions you have. Thank you for the introduction. You have mentioned that I have been a diplomat serving the French government for more than 30 years. Now I'm outside government. I'm part of academia and research as a trainer for junior diplomats. And since I understand your focus is international law, I could perhaps summarize my career and my approach as saying that international law is, of course, very important, crucial, especially in the field of international relations. But this is sometimes an insufficient approach to deal with very complex geopolitical issues. And therefore, when I'm asked for advice, when students wonder what focus they should be looking for, what sort of studies they should pursue, I say, if you have a chance, do both. Learn about international law because it's important. It's a base, one of the bases of our international law, international relations system, but also complement this with a political science approach, because this perhaps will help understand better how the law was formed, the treaties were negotiated, what were the interests behind these negotiations, how can you explain the outcome, which sometimes may be below expectations, and how this law is being implemented or not, and what the international community can do about this. So I think, in a nutshell, I would recommend to have these two approaches which complement each other.
Thank you, sir, for the brief introduction. We would like to ask you, firstly, considering your career and your experience in terms of nuclear proliferation and disarmament, how has the Ndte been beneficial to the world?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
How was the Ndte beneficial to the world and to the global community?
Well, of course, it's a very controversial issue. The Non-Proliferation Treaty is now celebrating half a century. It entered into force in 1970, and the Conference of State Parties, the review conference that was supposed to be held in New York but had to be postponed because of the coronavirus crisis, was supposed to take stock of 50 years of implementation or lack of implementation of this treaty. Of course, the treaty is considered as, by many states as the so-called cornerstone of international security and the basis for the actual three pillars of the treaty, which are non-proliferation, preventing new states to acquire nuclear weapons, disarmaments by those that have the weapons, and promotion of the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Now, when you look at the balance sheet of 50 years of after entering into force of the treaty, you could say, it's been very effective in preventing or limiting the scope, the spread of nuclear weapons. You may remember that in the early 60s, of course, for you it's ancient history. President Kennedy predicted that there could be up to 25, 30 states with nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, this didn't happen. Whether this is thanks to the NPT or whether it's because those states that gave up nuclear weapons or renounced the option of having nuclear weapons considered that this was a better approach for their own security and, of course, for the overall security. So that remains to be demonstrated, and it's, of course, difficult to demonstrate in abstract. Now, as you know, the main frustration of most states, governments, and civil society in general about this balance sheet is that the second pillar, disarmament, was not fulfilled as it was pledged. In the treaty, there is a famous Article 6, which has legal force, legal obligation for states parties to negotiate in good faith a number of things. One is the sort of short-term measures to prevent nuclear war. You could say that, in a sense, this has been successful because no nuclear war has taken place. But the second is measures for disarmament, meaning prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. And finally, a treaty on general and complete disarmament under international effective control, meaning, not that all kinds of weapons have to be eliminated, but that there should be a global effort to reduce arsenals and to, pave the way gradually to a world with lower levels of armaments. And this would be consistent with the obligations in the UN Charter to have lower levels of armament to precisely avoid this diversion of resources from the other needs of the international community and human societies, such as healthcare, as we can see now, or economic development. So, in a sense, you could say, yes, that NPT has been somehow successful, but it still, is a source of frustration for many countries. I've tried to summarize this in one tweet, because it's a good exercise to concentrate one's thoughts. And I said, in response to another tweet by an American ambassador who was very admirative of the NPT, wonderful success of the international community. The number of nuclear weapons compared to 1970, when the treaty entered into force, was multiplied by 2. We ended up with 10 states with nuclear weapons. One got rid of them. That's South Africa. And then if you look at the numbers of nuclear weapons in service for 15 years after entry into force, these numbers continue to increase, with all the nuclear power. And then they started to be reduced. But if you look at the numbers in 1970 and the current numbers, we're only down by 50%. Again, it's better than nothing, better than the 60,000 nuclear weapons that were reached at the top of the peak of the Cold War, but it's still so many times enough to destroy the whole humankind and the planet. So again, balanced results, and so certainly there is a need to go much beyond that.
Well, thank you for that answer of yours, sir. It was indeed very enlightening. And we have the next question. So we would like to know, how do you see India's nuclear and security imperatives? Do you think India as a BIMSTEC nation state can gauge itself as a stabilizing power if it becomes a permanent member of the UN Security Council, taking into context its legitimacy issues with respect to these hard and the soft powers?
Yeah, of course, this is a very important question, and the case of India is actually very interesting. Just purely from an academic point of view, if you study the history of armament and disarmament and the arms control effort, of course, India was always leading with the Ndte plan, and it's understandable that there was frustration on the part of India in the early 70s when NPT was concluded, and India felt that the pledge, the promise for reducing nuclear weapons and leading to complete elimination of nuclear weapons was too weak. And this analysis actually was demonstrated by the reality. And this explained why India said, after all, well, if the great powers produce nuclear weapons and are not eager to eliminate them so quickly, then we should also have our own nuclear weapons to defend ourselves. And that's how India acquired its nuclear weapons already de facto in 1974, and it confirmed its military capability in 1988, precisely also after the NPT was extended indefinitely. There was a sort of correlation because, despite all the criticisms from India and other countries about the lack of implementation of the NPT, especially the disarmament part, then India confirmed that it now needed to have its own nuclear weapons. But at the same time, it was, of course, too late for India to join the NPT because the treaty itself did not allow it. Once a country had tested nuclear weapons after 1967, 1st January 1967, it could not join the treaty as a recognized nuclear weapon state. So what was left for India to do? Well, as we've seen, it continued its efforts in favor of disarmament, but it was part of a global system, and its aspiration to become a permanent member of the Security Council also was fully legitimate because of India's importance, population, place in the community of nations. But the danger then would be to make the linkage, the correlation between permanent seat in the Security Council and possession of nuclear weapons. Because this would be the best argument to encourage proliferation. Because then, any state that would seek or feel legitimate to join the Security Council as a permanent member then would say, okay, in order to do so, the ticket to do it, to enter this status is to have nuclear weapons. So in practice, we should do just the reverse. Now, of course, there were several attempts in the past to enlarge the composition of Security Council, including permanent members, and of course, India would fit perfectly in this category. But then it was also important to include countries, including as permanent members, that don't have nuclear weapons, because that again it would break this linkage. And now, of course, in the current situation, we know everything is frozen because the reform of the Security Council requires a broad consensus, because of course it requires the approval of the existing 5 permanent members, and we know that Japan has also been has applied to join, but then China is not very comfortable with that. China also has objections to India joining, and then if you want a geographical representation of the key countries, there is no consensus within each region about which country should represent. Africa, you have Nigeria, Egypt, South Africa, Latin America, maybe Brazil, Argentina, and Asia, clearly, there is competition. So this is a sort of self-defeating attempt to if you want to enlarge the Security Council, you will need a different approach, a different process, where maybe a system like to appoint the Secretary General, where you have applicants, but then you have a sort of interview by all the members, and there's a vote. So now, unfortunately, the system of the 5 permanent members is a source for the council to be paralyzed. And to come back to the NPT and to arms control, this is also something that the majority of the international community that was frustrated by the insufficiency of disarmament also wanted to question. And so the first attempt to do that in an arms control treaty was the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, where you don't have a special status for states with nuclear weapons. All states are on the same footing, they're all equal. And if any one of them tests nuclear weapons, then there's a procedure, and of course it has to be detected, evidence brought about, and there is no sort of appellation or right of appeal to the Security Council, because one of the permanent members could be itself in non-compliance. The same philosophy, the same approach was adopted in the more recent treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, precisely to avoid any permanent member of the Security Council or currently NPT nuclear weapon state to veto anything. So the overwhelming majority of the international community adopted this treaty. It's being signed and ratified. It will probably enter into force in a few months. But now the question is how to attract nuclear armed states, not only the 5 official ones, but also India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea, etc. How to ensure that they join in a global approach, a global effort to pave the way for nuclear disarmament. And the way that the negotiators of the treaty found is, in my view, very open, very flexible. And of course, we know that the treaty now is rejected by all nuclear armed states because they fear, the main fear is about delegitimization of their nuclear weapon, which they consider as a legitimate weapon to ensure their security. But once the treaty enters into force, now we have 124 countries that support the treaty, it will be difficult for the nuclear armed states to continue as business as usual, to argue that, oh, this is a perfectly legitimate weapon that is part of, it's acceptable in terms of legitimate self-defense, etc. It will be considered as an illegal weapon by the overwhelming majority of the international community. So the only way for the states which have these weapons to join the international community, they have a choice, either to disarm on their own unilaterally and then join the treaty, like South Africa did when it joined the NPT. It said, now I can prove that I don't have nuclear weapons. The IAEA can come and inspect. I don't have nuclear weapons, so therefore I can join the treaty. So this could be one option. The second option would be states with nuclear weapons join the treaty, but they don't have a special status. They just have the obligation to present a plan for elimination of their weapons, in the time frame they consider it necessary or adapted to their needs. In a sense, this was the approach in the Chemical Weapons Convention. There was also a time frame for elimination of the weapons. The big possessors actually couldn't fulfill their time frames, so they had to negotiate extensions. Russia finally completed its destruction. The United States is still lagging behind because it had such a huge stockpile. But it shows that it's possible for states which possess weapons of mass destruction which are considered as illegal, prohibited, are allowed to possess them, provided they are in a process of eliminating them. And of course, they also pledge not to use them. So this is the second option that this treaty offers. And India,
Right.
of course, would be perfectly in line with its own policy in favor of disarmament. But of course, it seems difficult for any nuclear armed state to do this in isolation. So this is why there should be some sort of consultation or negotiation among all the states so that they could do this in an orderly manner and coordinated manner. But the signal they could, even if by a mere declaration that they intend to do so, would send a much better signal and that would increase actually the international security and not only the security of the nuclear armed states.
Well, so do you see any positive light among the AU, ASEAN, and SAARC nation states to engage into better security networks and notions to transform the conventional nodes of security governance in the global south due to the global north's relative influence over such issues for the years to come?
Well, of course, you raise a very important problem, and it's, I go back to my opening remarks that the legal aspect is, of course, very important, but then you have to consider all the geopolitical dimensions. And in a region like Asia, South Asia, but Southeast Asia, North Asia, there are so many conflicts, sometimes are very old conflicts, territorial conflicts, border delimitation, seawater borders, territorial, just competition, and it's a natural, traditional phenomenon of international relations that you have more powerful states that want to, seek regional hegemony, but they compete with others, and then you have also the external actors like the United States, other Western powers, UK, France, and of course China considers itself as part of the Asian region, but as we know now, it is competing with a number of countries, especially in the South China Sea. So all these conflicts, you will certainly not solve them only by addressing the symptoms and overarmaments, increase in arms, military spending, arms imports or exports. This is only the tip of the iceberg. This is the result of this conflict situation. So it's important, of course, to do as much as possible to avoid this getting out of control, to have international multilateral norms such as the Arms Trade Treaty, for instance. And it's a pity that so few Asian countries joined this treaty. And I know that one of the reasons is that they fear that if they are importing countries, they may be hampered in their import, or if they're exporting countries, they may be hampered in their export. Well, now the Arms Trade Treaty has been in force for 6 years, and you can see the arms trade still booming. So it didn't stop the arms trade. The main purpose of the treaty is to prevent the misuse of weapons, the use of conventional weapons against civilians, in domestic conflict, etc. So if only we manage to use the existing legal framework to achieve this objective, we would fulfill one of the objectives of the treaty, which is to reduce human suffering. Now, but again, you cannot count on such frameworks to solve all the existing conflicts. So that means you need bilateral efforts, regional efforts, sub-regional efforts, as you said, security structures. Europe has it took many years for Europe to put it into place, a common security structure. And it's still, I would say, work in progress, because you still have tensions within this broad organization, which is called the OSCE, where you see still NATO as one force, and with tensions with Russia, etc. So again, it's not, there is no magic bullets. But you need to have at least some structure for communication, dialogue, confidence building measures. And again, history has demonstrated that it's an illusion to have the ambition to start with the most difficult, getting rid of nuclear weapons, because there is so much belief. It's like almost a religious belief that this will ensure ultimate security. But before doing this, there are a number of things that can be done, and some that India has done. For instance, already for some time, India and Pakistan exchange every year a list of nuclear installations, civilian or military, that they agree not to target. So that's a confidence building measure, because it reduces the risk of nuclear war, or misperception or accident, unauthorized use, etc. So this example can be spread and can be multiplied throughout the region. But unless you, again, start seriously negotiating about delineation of borders, mutual relations, etc. I mean, take the case of North Korea, typical case of conflict, unsolved conflict, because the war is officially still going on since 1950. And unless there is a real peace treaty, so that's the legal framework, but also a number of other measures of mutual recognition, security assurances, economic cooperation, etc., North Korea will have no incentive to give up its nuclear weapons. It will continue to appear as a threat to other countries in the region. So again, it's not easy. It's very complex. Treaties can play a very important role, but that's not the end of the story.
Right. So Syed Akbaruddin, who was India's previous permanent representative at the United Nations, remarked in one of his interviews that one of the other primary issues of the high seas, again, that is because beyond the exclusive economic zones, that there is very little limited understanding of what states can do and what states cannot do. Now, why do you think that we must focus on these broader thematic issues?
Well, again, this is an example of where treaties could help. Negotiations of the Convention of the Law of the Seas was a very important development in the international history because it helped find agreements on a number of key issues like delineation of territorial waters, exclusive economic zones, etc. It's a multilateral effort. That means that all states have to bring their own contribution, accept mutual concessions, and the result is a sort of broad consensus. So again, it's an achievement, but then there are other issues which may have not been negotiated upon, and that opens the way for separate new negotiations. And also, as I said previously, the geopolitical dimension is so important, and that's where obviously there are economic interests, there is an economic competition, and therefore there should be a different because if you consider, for instance, that first a non-compliance with a treaty, okay, you violate the Convention on the Law of the Seas. First of all, there are states which either didn't sign or didn't ratify, and therefore they don't feel bound, and that creates a situation of uncertainty and chaos. But even states that have signed and ratified treaties sometimes don't implement them, don't comply with them. So it depends very much on the mechanism of the treaty. What is the non-compliance mechanism? Is it, again, going back to the Security Council, or do you have other means of settlement of disputes, peaceful settlement of dispute? Because, again, it's a legal obligation in the UN Charter. And so it depends very much on the goodwill and good faith of states to accept such forms of settlements. Like between China and Philippines, there was a judgment of the International Court of Justice. So this can be, it can be international arbitration, mediation, good offices. There are all sorts of means available, but at the minimum, you need a feeling of, or a mentality of cooperative, a cooperative spirit to address these issues, and not a sort of confrontational spirit. If you're a stronger state, then you will do what you want because you will have maybe the military means and power to impose your will, or impose sanctions on other states like the US is doing now as part of this unilateralist policy of maximum pressure. And we know this is bound to fail. And look at the overall results of sanctions all over the world in history. Almost none have achieved their objective, which was to change the behavior and policy of the state. So again, it takes a different system of international relations based on cooperative attitudes rather than confrontational attitudes.
Right. So another area of interest would obviously be technology with the human touch. And increasingly, resilience of human beings is an important factor that all of us have been confronted with. So where there are disasters, can we have a more humane approach to these? Do you think that India's credentials as a stabilizing power is a certain possibility?
Yes, of course. I mean, in the current crisis, the pandemic is sort of a wake-up call, is a reminder that, first of all, there are a number of threats which are global threats, and that means that no state, even the most powerful one, as we can see in the United States, can address these threats, can mitigate these threats on their own. The first reaction to this crisis first was to perhaps underestimate its impact, because there was a lack of scientific knowledge, but also perhaps there was a lack of trust and confidence in the scientists. And the second lesson is that there was a lack of coordination, cooperation, assistance, because even if the WHO tried to help, of course, because that's its mission, it has, again, no enforcing power. It has its guidelines, recommendations, but it cannot force states to declare lockdown, close borders, etc. So all this has to be done, of course, it has to be planned. There is a need for preparedness and international, global, multilateral approaches, because this cannot, again, be solved even in a regional context. So I think, this kind of crisis, which certainly will lead to a lot of changes in our way of thinking and behavior, is a good lesson. And certainly it didn't stop a lot of cases of assistance, compassion, community work, volunteers, people who came to help the health care workers, states, countries that brought assistance to others, sometimes maybe instrumentalizing this for propaganda purposes. But anyway, there were these trends within countries or internationally. But it is not enough. We had to make this a new paradigm. That's what I call the human security paradigm. This has to be the priority. Taking into consideration that all these threats are transnational, require multilateral global approaches, and non-confrontational approaches, cooperative approaches. Otherwise, again, they will not be solved.
Certainly, sir. As you previously mentioned, during this pandemic, the responses of nation-states were rather local and unilateral. Many states sealed their borders and adopted numerous restrictions on human rights and freedoms. But while these measures were enacting, pursuing a legitimate purpose, that is the protection of their citizens, will governments eventually use this state of emergency in order to enact more strongman policies? What do you think is the future of security in this context?
Yes, of course, it's always a temptation for governments facing a crisis, to declare exceptional measures, to reinforce the government's powers vis-a-vis the counterpowers, parliaments, the media, society. We have seen this in several countries. It is always an opportunity. When you have authoritarian regimes like in Russia or China, instead of investing more into public health or research, the first thing they do is, okay, let's invest in facial recognition so we can, control the population better, more easily. And so this is where I think there is a sort of international public opinion now, which expresses itself through social media. And this is becoming an international actor. It has already demonstrated that it has the power to put pressure, to push governments to accept, to change things, to adopt new measures. look in, the climate change movement, if you like, which has been translated in some international agreements, was initiated by civil society. Now we can see a lot of mobilization by young people because it's all about their future, and that it has this potential, and this should not be given up. Of course, every citizen in democracies has the right to vote and should vote. Sometimes we take it for granted. We don't even use this right, and the result is sometimes that authoritarian or populist leaders are elected. And so that, again, should be a wake-up call for every civil society group, every individual to get together, to be mobilized, to fight against these tendencies of authoritarianism, reduction of civil liberties, taking into account, of course, the need for balance. When you have a health crisis, you know that your private liberties or freedoms are going to be reduced. But this is for the common good. And so we have to accept this. Just like some time ago, there was this idea that to fight terrorism, we also have to accept, to be searched and that's of course, it's an impediment to our freedoms, to the economy, but we accept it because it has this stabilizing effect. In the health crisis, again, it's legitimate that there is lockdown, there is some restrictions, we have to wear face masks, etc. And I guess the vast majority of people accept that. But I guess what they won't accept is restrictions to expression, to criticize the government, for instance, for its handling of the crisis, or the right to demonstrate peacefully, respecting the health measures, etc. So again, it will not be automatic. It will require a lot of mobilization by people to avoid precisely this sort of evolution.
And another response which might be registered on behalf of the government would to pioneer sorts of recovery mechanisms. We all know that this pandemic crisis also triggered an economic crisis, which will have severe repercussions. So states must think and enact several recovery programs. While this pandemic also addressed questions like homelessness, we saw the case of the United States, which tackled homelessness by allowing homeless people to use abandoned houses. Will states stretch these recovery programs in order to protect otherwise marginalized or disadvantaged categories? And here I'm referring to programs such as a universal basic income. Will such a strategy be planned by governments in order to foster a better preparedness for disasters like this pandemic?
Yes, certainly, you're right. This is, of course, is going to be one of the most important consequences of the crisis. The need for this debate about strategic choices. And this is where, again, society will need to mobilize itself to ensure that their representatives, parliaments, do the right thing, take the right decisions, because after all, the resources available on this planet are limited. And as we have seen, a crisis like this reduces production, also consumption, and resources available, taxation, etc. So in the end, there will have to be a sort of new deal or new decision about the balance between priorities. And I think it will be very difficult for governments to resist now the mainstream consideration that public health, public welfare, just the well-being of people has to be the ultimate priority. And this will certainly have consequences, hopefully, on military spending. Now, you have these figures comparing the amount of billions which is wasted every year on nuclear weapons or conventional weapons compared to the budgets needed and that were made so vividly insufficient for healthcare. Just one figure, the public spending, military spending last year was almost $2 trillion, $1,917 billion just for the military and weapons all over the world. With 1 day of this military spending, you could increase by half the budget of WHO. In other words, the current budget of WHO, which, by the way, is losing the American contribution, is less than 1 day of military spending. That shows the discrepancy, this huge gap between what is spent on the military on preparing to kill versus what is spent on preserving life. And that, this choice will have to be made in many countries.
Thank you. I will be now addressing a question which has been submitted on YouTube. One of our followers wishes to know if there are any restrictions between nations, for example, like India and Pakistan, not to target each other with nuclear weapons, not to target each other with biological weapons in the same way non-proliferation treaties with nuclear weapons work. So the protection is extended to biological weapons.
Yes, there is a specific treaty, a convention on biological and toxic weapons, which has been signed and ratified by India and Pakistan. So they both agree not to use or to develop, to protect, to possess biological weapons. And there have been actually strong supporters of this treaty, which is almost universal. So there is a sort of consensus. Some lawyers would say even customary law, because it's a very old prohibition, a very old taboo, which has been codified and now is basically applied by all states. There is an addition. There were actually two problems. When this treaty was negotiated, this was during the Cold War, after the US gave up its own biological weapons program, then convinced the Soviet Union to do the same, and then it became multilateral. The first problem was that it was negotiated rather quickly, and the negotiators considered that there was no need to have a verification regime included in the treaty, because it's basically nobody would brag, would be proud to have these weapons. They are considered as horrendous weapons. So and even the military would say they don't even have any utility, military utility, which is one of the bases of international humanitarian law. So they didn't think it was useful to have this verification regime. Unlike the Chemical Weapons Convention, which was negotiated 20 years later, and it was considered important to have a very strong, intrusive verification regime with inspections, a dedicated organization. But in the meantime, what happened was the Soviet Union, that was one of the depositories of the treaty, was found cheating. And this was revealed by Yeltsin after the collapse of the Soviet Union. For all this time, for 20 years, the Soviet Union kept secret offensive biological weapons programs. And then, of course, Yeltsin destroyed them all, and now Russia is, I would say, compliant. Now, that raised the question of whether the treaty would need to have an additional protocol to be able to verify its implementation. And there was a broad consensus that this should be done on the model of the Chemical Weapons Convention. So there were negotiations between 1994 and 2001. But then in 2001, the Bush administration, they decided, no, we don't want this. It may be dangerous for our own biotechnology industry. Anyway, so no protocol, no verification, and instead a series of meetings with experts to consider and work on other means of ensuring that no such weapons are being produced or ever used. The second aspect was the risk of such weapons being used by terrorists. And there were a few cases, like in Japan, cult, and a few other places, not always actually against humans, but can also be used against animals or plants. And in order to prevent this from happening, this is probably one of the good things that the Bush administration did. It convinced the Security Council to adopt a legally binding resolution 1540 in 2004, that obliges all UN member states to legislate and regulate to prevent any form of access by non-state actors to weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, biological, and chemical. And that means there are a number of obligations which are derived from this broad obligation. And so this is still a requirement on all states, which is very demanding, especially for developing countries. You need to have proper legislation, criminalization, law enforcement, border control, all sorts of things, which requires capacity and resources. So therefore, there is an obligation of reporting regularly about what is being done. So that's another international effort, again, based on cooperation, that has been so far fairly successful. The risk is always there because it's becoming easier and easier to manipulate DNA, gene editing. This is becoming available freely almost on the internet. And that's why actually there were lots of conspiracy theories about the COVID-19 being the result of such manipulation, man-made virus in a Chinese lab. Fortunately, all the experts have demonstrated that this is not the case. It could not have happened because of the structure of the DNA of this virus. But the risk is there still potentially. There were some labs that worked on the so-called Spanish flu, and very dangerous virus that killed millions. And if you have this available now, and anyone can spread it, again, the consequences will be devastating. So what's the conclusion is that you use the keyword preparedness. If societies are better equipped, with qualified healthcare personnel, well-equipped hospitals, well-funded healthcare systems with universal healthcare, and all the equipment available in stockpiles, any form of disease, whether it's natural, accidental, or intentional, would not cause the same damage. So in a sense, it's a form of disincentive for the terrorist or anyone who would be tempted to use disease as a weapon, because the impact would not be very dramatic. You mentioned another aspect, which is the social consequences of pandemics. And we have seen again the various situations when you have systems like based on social democracy, welfare state, which prevents massive layouts and unemployment and misery, compared to the sort of traditional capitalist systems where there is no insurance, everybody's on their own, and if you don't have employment, then you don't have any resources. So certainly, again, that would be one of the conclusions, that if we want to avoid this kind of catastrophic consequences, we'll have to improve our social systems.
Thank you, sir. Another question which has been written concerns the way we, as a state or as an international community, can hold the Chinese People's Republic responsible for spreading or failing to prevent this pandemic if sufficient evidence will be provided. What actions can be taken against China?
Well, again, this is very hypothetical, because if there is evidence, I'm not sure we will ever have access to it, that this virus was manipulated, was a result of an intentional decision or even accidental, then of course we could ask questions, ask for clarification within the framework of the Biological Weapons Convention, because this would clearly be a potential breach of the convention.
Is China a signatory party to this convention?
Yes, China is party, and it's been an active supporter, and But of course, the question then is all about the control of the governments, especially in such a huge country like China. Government cannot, even with a strong security apparatus, authoritarian regime, very difficult to control everything. So there are other forms of ensuring, as a ways of ensuring that this is not done. There is a sort of feeling that among the scientific community, there are limits to what can be done. There's been many years of awareness raising efforts precisely to spread throughout academia good practices, safety levels, codes of conduct, and here we have a sort of dilemma again, because the basis of science and scientific community is transparency, sharing results, sharing publications for the benefit of the whole humankind. On the other hand, if you share too much sensitive information that can be used for bad and malicious purposes, such as creating a biological weapon, then you might run into difficulty. So again, it's a matter of ethical, social, and professional responsibility that has to be widespread. That should be part of, I would say, the education, the curriculum, part of this research community. Then, with the worst case scenario, if, again, we have evidence of deliberate breach of the commitments of the legal obligations, the question remains, what do we do? That's why sometimes we have these treaties, but there's no enforcement mechanism. And that is, of course, it could become a very difficult issue, even dangerous, because the tendency could be to deal with this unilaterally. And this is what the US is considering doing, applying bilateral sanctions, unilateral sanctions. And again, this doesn't solve the problem, as we've seen with North Korea, with Iran. It's a punitive approach. And what is needed is just the opposite, is a cooperative approach. Trying to, of course, to have full transparency, but at the same time, ensuring that this doesn't happen again.
Certainly, but how then may we envisage another method of holding China or another state accountable instead of unilateral punitive measures? Because in order to enforce a judgment of the International Court of Justice, for example, according to the United Nations Charter, the state has to address the Security Council. And while China is a member of the Security Council, we might not see a resolution taking place, a resolution being enforced, particularly aimed at condemning China.
Yes, obviously, this is one of the main weaknesses of the whole UN system. And so it has actually led to a form of paralysis of the Security Council. You know, when you see the Council incapable of solving conflicts where one of the permanent members is a party or is supporting one of the actors, like Russia, Ukraine, or Syria, you know, clearly it's a main flaw. So what can be done? Again, reforming the Security Council, as we've said, is because it's one option, but it's not so easy. I would say the resort is mostly name and shame, you know, using all forms of statements, public statements supported by majority of countries or civil society organizations. Because, I mean, certainly regimes like authoritarian regimes like China don't like to be cornered, don't like to be isolated, losing face, losing influence among their clients or the states where they want to expand markets support. So that is the only, I would say, legitimate resort, and certainly the use of force should be avoided at all costs.
Thank you, sir. Another follower has addressed the question of how will the status of Iran as a nuclear power affect its regional position in its area, and how other states from the Middle East will respond to Iran's nuclear developments.
Yeah, very, very important case study. And of course, it's still very current, very relevant today. It's still high on the agenda. Now, looking back, of course, we know, those who have studied the history of this issue know that there was a time when the Iranian regime, after the revolution, did consider acquiring nuclear weapons. The main driver was not so much Israel, that is a nuclear power, although it doesn't admit so, but was the rising nuclear program conducted by Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Once Saddam Hussein was defeated, its programs were dismantled by the United Nations. Iran didn't have any reason to acquire nuclear weapons, and it stopped any form of research or investment in weapons. It did, however, want to be able to develop the technology to produce fissile material, now officially, of course, always for peaceful purposes, but there are, several thresholds above which, once you enrich uranium above 5%, then you can reach 20%, and then more easily, more quickly, 90%, which is the military grade. Now, Iran wanted to be able to have this flexibility, at least to acquire the technology to do so, in case it would decide to acquire nuclear weapons, to make nuclear weapons. Again, the international efforts, the multilateral agreement that was concluded in 2015, the JCPOA, allowed Iran to keep maintaining this know-how, this technology, but at a low level that would not allow Iran to make nuclear weapons. This was the whole idea of all these restrictions on the volume of enriched uranium, the degree of enrichment, and of course, in the inspections, the sort of permanent inspections of the IAEA. Now, of course, we are in a different situation because the United States withdrew from the agreement. Iran didn't continue to implement its obligations for 1 year, and after 1 year, because the US had reimposed sanctions and that Europeans and Russia and China did not prevent those sanctions from happening, Iran considered that because the agreement was based on reciprocity, if one party doesn't respect its commitments, the United States, then Iran feels it is legitimate to reduce its own commitments. And that's what Iran started doing. But this was done in such a way that it was easily reversible, and it always remained at a low level. That means much below the level that existed prior to the agreement, and anyway prior and below the level that would allow Iran to manufacture nuclear weapons if it decided to do so. We are in this transition phase with tensions still very high because we had military confrontation between Iran and the United States. And I would say the crucial point, the tipping point would be if Iran is aggressed militarily by the United States or by Israel, both, it would then take a strategic decision, perhaps to get out, to withdraw again from the JCPOA or even the Non-Proliferation Treaty and decide to acquire nuclear weapons. Again, purely hypothetical, it's sometimes used as a threat, but that's a bargaining chip. And this could happen only in response to what Iran felt was an aggression that made this decision to acquire nuclear weapons necessary, indispensable to protect itself. Hopefully, this would be the worst case scenario because it would perhaps justify even more military action or preemptive strikes, and could also start the new domino theory with Saudi Arabia developing nuclear weapons or acquiring nuclear weapons, Turkey, etc. So certainly worst case scenario that the JCPOA was precisely negotiated to prevent.
Thank you, sir. Another question which I'd like to ask you is how will the international imagery evolve after this pandemic? I mean, we all saw the decision of the United States to retract its funds from the World Health Organizations. How will this pandemic affect international organizations as political and legal actors in terms of budget resilience? How will these actors imagine their funding opportunities in the near future? As states, some of them will will prefer more unilateral and local action instead of a global response.
Yes, of course, it's always a risk. We've seen a tendency even before this pandemic for unilateralism on the part of the United States or Israel, or authoritarian regimes, populism in Europe. It's a very dangerous trend, of course, because we don't know how far it can go and how badly it can affect the lives of our societies and international relations. But the potential is very serious. I think that this pandemic could act as I said, a wake-up call, a call for more multilateral action, cooperative action, more balanced spending. Again, when you see this huge gap, this huge discrepancy between military spending and health spending, I'm sure that responsible leaders will take this into account. And certainly the role of civil society in parliaments, media is to continue making this point that we have to rebalance, to find new priorities and be it only to get prepared for the next crisis, which we know will happen sooner or later.
Thank you, sir. I will let my colleague, Amelia, to continue with the questions.
Okay, this is the last question for the session, and I would like to know your opinion regarding the if you think that the set of negotiations of the peace deals which happened in the Afghanistan would have a positive impact on the world and probably motivate the world and take it forward to be venture into a practical realm of pacifism.
Yeah, again, unfortunately, Afghanistan is one of those cases where we have the evidence, we have the demonstration that the policy followed until now has failed. This policy has been based on external intervention, after 9/11, which maybe have some legitimacy at the time to stop the Taliban helping out with training Al-Qaeda. But then, because this was there was no strategy, no exit strategy, and no consideration of peace building. The concept of peace building, meaning what has to be done after conflict is at least stabilized, either by peacekeeping force or a ceasefire or a sort of preliminary peace agreement. Everything has to be done. Reconstruction, elections, rights of minorities, which sometimes were at the root cause of the conflict, law and order, refugees, IDPs, gender, all these issues. And so it's a nightmare for, of course, the people in the country, but also for the international community who's willing to assist them. Where to start, what's the sequencing, what's the priority. And also, it's clear that it needs funding. So, as we have seen in Afghanistan, there was no real effort to negotiate among all the former combatants, no real effort to disarm the former combatants, no real efforts to build a new country based on consensus, with a sort of national decision to shape the institutions, to to relate with the neighbors, etc. So again, we have to learn from those lessons and certainly to do more. The agreements between the US and the Taliban, of course, is interesting in this aspect because it shows that the United States realized that the pure military approach failed, that you needed some form of negotiation with one of the key actors. But if this actor refuses to negotiate with the recognized governments, you know, this agreement is not even worth the paper it's written on. So that's why it's important to have not only one key actor like the States. Of course, the administration wants to be able to withdraw all its troops because it costs a lot of money and domestically it has a bad image. But then it has to include all the other actors. I mean, India, certainly, Pakistan, Russia, China, to have, again, a coordinated approach, no real competition, but all there to ensure that there is a real national reconciliation, national peace building strategy, how to rebuild the country for the future.
Right. Thank you so much, sir. I believe that it was a very enlightening and knowledge enriching session, and it was a pleasure to have you here. I, on behalf of the entire team of Internationalism and the South Asian Journal for International Law, express a heartfelt gratitude for you to, for being with us in this interview session. And I hope that, and I look forward for more such interacting sessions with you. And with this, I believe we will be concluding these sessions.
Thank you very much and continue the good work.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you a lot. It has been a pleasure and an honor to have you here today.
Thank you.